Welcome to the Transform Your Relationship podcast, where we'll go beyond the typical relationship advice. I'm your host, Manisha Terry, somatic healing practitioner and mentor. Each week, I'll share personal insights, client success stories, and how my holistic trauma-informed approach can help you transform your relationship from the inside out. You'll learn ways to recognize and prioritize your needs, get to the root of what's upsetting you, and courageously ask for what you want so you can confidently co-create the relationship you desire. You'll also hear from guest experts who will be invited to share their unique approaches to transformation, and at the end of each episode, you'll receive one tangible practice you can implement right away to transform your relationship. Let's dive in. Hey everybody, welcome to this week's episode of the Transform Your Relationship podcast. I'm your host, Manisha. Thank you so much for being here. It is June. It will be June 7th when this is aired, and it will officially be the first year anniversary of the release of my first two episodes of this podcast. So I just wanted to take a moment to celebrate that with all of you, and thank you if you have been a listener since day one, if you've listened here and there on a walk or a drive, and also if you are brand new and you're joining me for the first time today. So for those of you who are new, welcome again. And just to give you a little bit of background, I created this podcast so that I could have the types of conversations I love to have about healing from the inside out, all kinds of different healing modalities, and really how you can get to know yourself and what you need and bring all of yourself to a relationship so that you can have really fulfilling, joyful relationships. I also talk about this quite a bit through the lens of being highly sensitive because that's my personal experience and also the experience of the majority of clients that I support, because frankly, what comes up in relationships, I think, just hits a little bit differently when you have a sensitive nervous system, and I think it's really important to have a space to explore that. On that note, I am excited to explore this topic today of deciding when to speak up in your relationships. And before we dive in, I'd love to invite you just to think about what that means for you, how you speak up in relationships, how it feels. Do you feel confident? Do you feel nervous? What do you notice coming up in your own body, mind, heart when you have to say something important in a relationship? I think that's helpful for a little bit of context. And also, I do certainly think this topic is relevant for everybody, but as we continue, I will share here and there a few reasons why I think it might be a little bit different if you're highly sensitive as well. One of the things that inspired this particular episode are actually two pretty recent sessions I had where both people I was talking with who had very different situations were both feeling overwhelmed with their emotions and just a lot of what was happening for them in the context of their relationships with other people. And they were trying to decide what to do and what to say to the other people involved. And without giving anything confidential away, I'll just share that one woman was dealing with a situation where she felt hurt by a family member, and she was trying to figure out the best thing to say and when to say it and how to do it. And the other person was dealing with a lot of challenges that were coming up around some unexpected house-related projects, where she was working with a particular vendor who wasn't delivering the product properly. And on top of that, there was a financial strain, which was creating a lot of additional stress and a feeling of overwhelm. And she was trying to figure out what she needed to say and how to be really clear in expressing it, while feeling quite a bit of stress around this whole situation in her mind and in her body. And I share a little bit about the backstories because I think that we can all relate to these in different ways. I can't imagine a single person who has not had a challenge with a family member where they were trying to figure out what to say. And to be honest, even deciding whether it was worth saying in the first place. And then we all deal with different things, right? That come up with our homes, that come up in our workplaces. And ultimately, we're working things out with another human. So there are relationships involved. So while I tend to talk more on this podcast about personal relationships or maybe more romantic relationships, really like when we think about how we interact in relationships, how we work through our emotions, how we figure out what to say, how to speak up, what's appropriate, what makes sense. We're dealing with relationships across the board. So as I was having these conversations with these two different women, it really got me thinking about this process that I often take my clients through, where the main focus of that particular part of the session is really helping them to work through the different emotions that are arising, because it's often the emotions and maybe the confusion that comes along with it, or the sense of overwhelm, that really can keep people stuck in terms of the next thing to say or the next thing to do. And when we are thinking about what's the right thing to say, what's the right thing to do, it's so valuable to do that from a place of feeling grounded and feeling clear. And as we all know, and I'm sure many of us have experienced, that does not always happen. Sometimes our emotions can really take over, and that's where we start to speak from. And if you have listened to me for any length of time, you know that I hold emotions in pretty high regard. So this is definitely not going to be an episode where I'm telling you to disregard your emotions in any way, shape, or form. And again, if you've listened to me for any length of time, you know that for me, the best way to get to that place of grounded clarity is not only through our mind and not only through navigating the emotions, but it's really to drop into our bodies with the help of our minds to give us context, to help make sense of things, and really with learning how to interpret and understand our emotions. It's so typical for all of us to approach communication from a mental place. And when deciding if you want to or need to speak up in a relationship, one of the very common things we can do is sit and think about it, do a little reflection, take a walk, let it move through our minds, maybe talk to a few people to get their opinion, make a pro and con list. These are all very typical and very helpful things, that can work for a lot of situations. However, when there's a situation involved where there's also a lot of emotion involved and a lot of stress involved, deciding what and how to say something, might be coming from a place of high emotions, or as I was saying before, confusion. And so when we're speaking from that place of really intense emotions, maybe not feeling totally clear about how we're feeling about something, it's generally not the most impactful. However, when we are in close relationships, there might be situations where you're really feeling overwhelmed and triggered, and you're trying to get something off your chest, you're venting, you're expressing your frustration, your anger, or your sadness. And even in that moment, when it feels raw and messy, there are specific relationships, like with close family members or your partner, where this might work for you. Maybe you have that kind of interaction where when you're feeling a lot, you're able to speak it out and the other person gets it, and you both can work it out this way. There are situations where that could work for people because they're both in it together. And there's many situations where that would be a lot less impactful. Certainly in a work situation or where you're with colleagues or out in public, this probably is not going to be the best way to go about things. And in terms of your, much closer, more intimate or personal relationships, again, this may work in different scenarios. And only you can know how effective this is, right? Like if this is your communication pattern and you can move through a lot of feelings and emotions and you can hear the other person if they are doing the same and you can get to a conclusion, then this is working for you. So that's great. In other scenarios, which I have heard certainly over the years from many of my clients who are highly sensitive, they tend to feel overwhelmed by their emotions. Maybe they're feeling triggered by something their partner has said. They're feeling this intense load, and without even realizing it, they might also be feeling the feelings of the other person as well as what they are experiencing. Because when you're highly sensitive, it's pretty common to be able to pick up on other people's emotions. And if you're not aware of that, or you're not really sure what's yours or what's somebody else's, it can be really difficult to trust how you're actually feeling and be able to communicate that clearly. And you might find that this type of communication isn't actually working for you. You might be able to get a lot out, but at the end, maybe you're both still feeling a little bit frustrated and confused, and there's not a lot of clarity on the other side. Or, it dissipates some tension in the moment, but you end up having the same type of argument or interaction over and over again, and you don't really see that your overall communication or understanding of each other and what you each need is really shifting over time. But as I was saying before, I also believe that your feelings and your reactions are telling you something. I always think, even if it's coming from a place of being triggered or being overwhelmed, that's information, that's data that we can be using. So when we can learn to decipher that and not just push it down or throw it away because it feels like too much, or maybe we've been told that we're exaggerating or too sensitive, there's still something there that something inside of you wants you to know. And so there are definitely ways to figure out what that is without necessarily expressing it or venting it in the moment, without any sense of clarity, even for yourself, to understand, like, what is this intense emotion telling you? Like, if you're feeling suddenly angry, what is this really telling you? Is it telling you that you need a different boundary? Is it telling you that you haven't really taken care of yourself? Is it telling you that perhaps you're just feeling taken for granted in this moment? It can be telling you a different thing based on who you are and like what your life experience has been. And, if I'm feeling angry and you're feeling angry, the origin of that can be very, very different, right? So in order to decipher that or really understand what the next best thing to do or say is, it's really important to know why we're even feeling a certain way. And if you're in this place where you're really trying to figure out, what am I feeling and perhaps why am I feeling this way? Again, our natural inclination is to start digging around in our minds and finding reasons of, well, this person said this thing, or this happened, or they did this, or I did this, and this is why I feel this way. And while some of those things could certainly be true, what I really find is that when we drop all of the stories around what we think it could be, and we really get quiet and start to pay attention to what's happening inside of us in terms of our sensations and the feelings, the discomfort, the pressure or the intensity we might feel in our bodies and in different places, that can actually help dissipate some of those surface level emotions and help us get to what is truly underneath. And this is where somatic work comes in for me. This is how I support my clients. And I really feel that it helps us bridge the two. So we get to honor the emotions, feel our way through, metabolize what we need to metabolize, release what really is not relevant in that moment anymore because we got a chance to process it, but also use what we know about ourselves, like use or recognize the stories and use our minds to help us see these patterns and tendencies that I have. So when we can really bridge these places or these two parts, like of our emotions, our sensations, what's happening in our body, and then use our mind to speak from like a much more clear and neutral place, like that's where we can make such a huge impact in our communication. And when speaking up can actually get us closer to what we want. One of the first things that if someone is bringing me a situation in a session that I talk about or help them sort through, really through bringing them into their bodies and guiding them through this process, is to sort through what are they feeling and what might they be picking up on, right? So first you get clarity on what you're experiencing, so you're not sitting there processing for yourself and processing for somebody else. That is their job and their responsibility. And when you start to take that on, it actually doesn't help anybody. And when we can pick up on that and we make assumptions, that is where misunderstandings can happen as well. Also, if you're having this like very urgent need to speak something or to say something, it might also be because you really want a particular response from the other person, or you really want them to understand exactly how you're feeling. And this is normal. Like, we talk about dependence or codependence or interdependence or being independent. But at the end of the day, like, we do want to be heard and understood by other people, of course, by the people that love us and we love. And so if we are feeling hurt or betrayed, of course, we want the other person to be able to understand that. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what I do think is important is to recognize when we're saying or speaking something, if we are very, very attached to what we want on the other side and we don't get it, then you really want to reflect on, okay, like, why am I doing this? Like, what is this for? What purpose is this serving? And if I don't get that thing, am I still going to be okay saying this? Does this still feel important to say? Or is there a different thing I can say or way I can say it to help me just get closer to the thing that I'm really wanting? And there's no right or wrong answer on the other side of this. It's really about what works for you after you've gone through your own internal process, and having someone to work with and sit with who is a neutral person who is really helping you tune back into your own body and your mind and your heart and your own truth can be really powerful, especially when you're just overwhelmed with your own emotions, which, let's face it, when we're struggling with something or we're really in it, it can be really difficult to see what the next right thing is to do. And specifically, one of the things that can be really helpful when you have somebody to sit with you through some of this work is it becomes less about the story. And when we're really in it, it can be very much involved with me versus them. And I did this and they did this and I'm right and they're wrong, or whatever we get into, right? Like blame and judgment and all of these things. But when you're working in a somatic way, you, for that moment in time, are really dropping the story, and it's becoming much more about your internal experience, about what you're noticing in terms of your emotions, but also sensations, sometimes the discomfort, the fears, and really then the emotions that are hiding under the surface or that are a few layers deep that you haven't quite gotten to because you've been really wrapped up in the story and the emotions that were more at the surface. And what often also comes are these experiences or memories of just earlier life experiences that might be triggered in this current experience. So, for example, if you're having a argument with a partner and they say something that's very dismissive, while obviously that is frustrating and not okay in the moment, you could be frustrated and angry about that. And if you notice that you are very, very unsettled and deeply upset, and while whatever is happening in the current moment doesn't feel great, you just notice this very exaggerated response. That's often because something from the past is being triggered at that same time. So maybe that was a common experience for you growing up. Maybe you spoke up, and when you did, you weren't listened to, or you were dismissed, or your words were diminished, or you were not held as important. And so when these things happen in our adult lives and we feel this really deep trigger or this very part of us that becomes extremely reactive, that is disproportional to what's happening in the present moment, then we can start to get curious and wonder what else this might be related to. And when we process this in our body somatically, we get to process what it felt like, what the sensation was like, and metabolize that. When we do that in our bodies and we're metabolizing it and we're not going into the story of it, you don't have to remember everything that happened. You don't have to then go find the person that did this and say anything to them. It's really just processing everything through your body, bringing your nervous system into more of a calm state. Then you don't necessarily have that intense reaction in your current life anymore. And that's one of the briefest ways that I can explain how somatic work works, because I think all of us, we want to understand, well, how does that really work? How does that really help me? And that's one of the ways that I have seen it work really, really powerfully for people, because they're not getting into the story again and they don't have to remember all the details, but when they can really sit with it and sit with the discomfort and let that move through, then you no longer have this need or this part of you that's getting activated or triggered in current life. So again, if your partner then says something dismissive to you again after you've worked this out, yes, it might still be very annoying. And you could probably, with much more neutrality, just say hey, that didn't feel good, or I don't want you to speak to me that way, instead of having this like very significant like emotional reaction. And I find that, when I'm working with clients, sometimes they'll say, I tried to say something, but my throat got blocked and I couldn't speak up, or I just felt a lot of tears and I started crying and I couldn't get my words out. And that's when there is something really behind it that wants to be seen and heard and worked with. And when we can get to that place through sitting and being and really allowing that to be processed, then in current time, we can speak up in a way that's very clear and very powerful. So I do hope that that's helpful. If you have questions about that, feel free to reach out to me. And again, it's also not something you can fully explain with words. I will just be honest. It is really something that you can better understand once you experience it. So again, I'm hoping that this was helpful, just to give you like a little bit of insight, or hopefully just to give your brain something to hold on to, because my brain certainly likes things to hold on to when I'm trying to understand something. And to wrap up from what I had started to share earlier about the two women who inspired this episode, as we went through the process of sorting through the emotional pieces and then making some connections to their own, either early experiences or tendencies or patterns, they were really able to come to their own conclusion in a way that felt really grounded. So the first woman who had the family incident decided that it was not worth saying anything to the family member at this time. Historically, it hadn't gone well when she had brought things up in the past, and it just didn't feel like the right use of her energy to pursue that at this time. But she did feel that in the future, if it still felt important, she could address it from a much more neutral place because she had really worked out the emotional pieces internally. And the second woman got really clear on what she needed to say to move forward with this particular vendor that she was working with. And she was able to recognize this pattern that she's had for probably her whole life, even if she can't remember the earliest memory of it, but to just be accommodating or too nice or not make other people feel bad. And she did not want that to play out in this scenario. And she could see that based on how she was feeling and reacting, that could have gotten that way. So once she got a little bit more clarity on that, she really decided that she needed to speak up in a way that asked this person to take responsibility for the mistake that they had made, and she was much more ready to have that conversation. So I hope that this was a helpful frame for you, just to see how you don't always have to do mental gymnastics to figure out the best way forward, especially when you're emotionally charged around something. It's so important to sit with and work through the emotional pieces of it, because I have never seen a situation where someone has done that and they haven't gotten to a clearer place on the other side, so that they can at least feel a little more confident, and even safer and more secure in their bodies to be able to say what they need to say. And there are absolutely ways to work through your emotions so that you can take the information that your triggers or those emotions are giving you and then put them into action, in a way that really honors you and your energy. So, I like to give a little bit of homework. One takeaway from today's episode, or one practice I would recommend, is that if you're in a position where you're wanting to speak up or say something to somebody in your life, when you're deciding around it, a great question to ask yourself, or even journal around, because I think writing just has a different impact on how we process things, is, what do I want or need from the other side of this? So if you say something, what is it that you're looking for on the other side? Right? It's a really simple question, but it can be really powerful, so that you can start to notice and understand what your true motivation is for speaking up. And then, see if there's any old stories that are coming up, or anything else that might be clouding your judgment or impacting the way you're feeling about it in current time. And for those of you who are looking for this type of somatic work with an experienced practitioner, I'm really, really happy and excited to share that I'm going to be opening up more ways to work with me one-on-one that don't require a long-term commitment. I still am keeping open my mentorship for a limited number of people, but what I have really come to see more recently is that This work is so powerful, and sometimes it can be difficult to make a long-term commitment, especially when one, you're not entirely sure how somatic work will play out for you, and two, you might just not be in a place where that's really necessary. There might be different situations in your life that you're trying to work through and you need a little bit of support, and a few sessions would be perfect for that. So there are single sessions and there will be multi-session packages. It's not up on my website yet, but if you want to check that out, just send me an email, or you can private message me on Facebook or Instagram and just ask for the information. I can give you the scheduler. The single sessions will currently be priced at under $300. If you get a multi-session package, they will be a little bit less. So I really wanted to create a more accessible way for you to work with me without the long-term commitment. And I will be sharing all the details and all the places soon. But for now, as I said, if you're interested, just send me a message and I can send you the details as well as the scheduling links. Again, hoping this served you, and I will see you the next time. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's episode of the Transform Your Relationship podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to help more people find us so they can transform their relationships too. As a thank you, every month, we'll pick one winner to receive a free 45-minute one-on-one somatic coaching session with me to explore and gain clarity around a relationship challenge. And if you know somebody who could benefit from listening to the show, then please do share and help me reach more highly sensitive women who want to experience richer, more connected relationships.